Oh, yeah. Okay. Some gardening books published by Garden Path Press recommend tilling the soil and adding compost before starting a new garden on a site, but they do not explain the difference between hot and cold composting. Since any gardening book that recommends adding compost is flawed, if it does not explain at least the basics of composting, some books published by Garden Path are flawed.
All right, so what is our conclusion?
That some books published by Garden Path are flawed.
Yes, and what is our support for this?
They're flawed because they're missing information about composting. They don't explain the difference between hot and cold composting.
And then we go on to say, like, since any gardening book that recommends adding compost is flawed, if it does not explain at least the basics of composting, since any gardening book that recommends adding compost is flawed, if it does not, what?
So it has to explain at least the basics of composting, or it's flawed.
But if they recommend adding compost, so we're saying that even if they add compost, it's flawed, but they don't explain the basics of it, it also is flawed. Okay, cool. What kind of question is this?
What kind of question is it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, like a sufficient assumption question?
Yeah, or whatever it is.
Oh, requires is necessary.
Excellent. So what is our goal of a necessary assumption question?
To find an answer that if the conclusion is 100% true, then it is true.
Yeah, so it's like something that's needed in order for our conclusion to have a chance, right?
Okay, yeah.
So at least one books published by Garden Path are flawed. All right. So go ahead and walk me through these answer choices.
Okay. So some gardening books that recommend tilling the soil and adding compost before starting a new garden are not flawed. And I don't think that's it, because they didn't really talk about tilling.
Well, it did up here a little bit. It says that some gardening books published, it recommends tilling in soil and adding compost before starting a new gardening site. But we don't care about talking about something not being flawed. We're trying to say what's needed in order for at least one of their books to be flawed. So we don't really care that one of them is not flawed.
Okay. Then gardeners should not add compost to the soil unless they have a thorough understanding of composting. And I don't think it's that either, because we're trying to figure out why some books are flawed.
Yeah, this has nothing to do with being flawed.
Mm-hmm. All right, an explanation of the basics of composting must include an explanation of the difference between hot and cold composting. Explanation of the basics. The basics of composting. Maybe.
Okay.
Explanation of the basics of composting must include an explanation of the difference between hot and cold composting. Maybe. I don't know. Because it does talk about they have to explain at least some of the basics.
Yeah, I don't think that one's like terrible.
Okay. Maybe that one. Let's see. Everyone who understands the difference between hot and cold composting understands at least the basics of composting. Everyone who understands the difference? No, I don't think so. I don't really know why. I don't really know that one. That one doesn't sound right, but I'm not really sure why.
Sorry, can I read this one to myself really quick? We're good.
I don't know. D is where I'm at. See, it can hang.
Okay, so everyone who understands the difference between hot and cold composting understands at least the basics. Well, cool that everyone that understands these things understand the basics, but that doesn't mean if they don't understand these things, they also don't like we need that understanding the difference between hot and cold to almost be a part of the basics, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's why D is wrong.
Okay. So
Like
then
this is like me saying like everyone who understands calculus understands addition. And like a book needs to explain addition in order to like, be adequate about teaching math. Well, just because like I can understand calculus doesn't mean that everyone needs to understand calculus to understand the basics of math, right?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And then E says no gardening book that includes an explanation of at least the basics of composting is flawed. And that is the answer I went with, the bottom one. So I know that one's not right.
Yeah, and this is flipped, right?
Okay, so hang on. So no gardening book that includes an explanation of at least the basics of composting is flawed. What do you mean it's flipped?
So no, okay. So if a book includes an explanation of the basics, it's not flawed, right?
Right.
So if it is flawed, then it doesn't include the basics. Where our conclusion is saying we're trying to say that something is flawed. Where this our sufficient here just tells us if it's not flawed. Or you're like, okay, I can tell that you're not.
No, I still don't understand why it's wrong though.
Okay, so no gardening book that includes an explanation of at least the basics of the compost is flawed. Okay, actually, let's go a different route. Does it have to be true that must it be true that no gardening book that includes the basics is flawed? What if one of these books is flawed? Does that destroy our conclusion that some books published by the Garden Path Company are flawed?
If just one random gardening book is flawed?
Yeah.
No.
So like the fact that it says no gardening book that includes these things is flawed, like it's too strong. It's not necessary. It's not needed.
Okay.
So no gardening book that includes an explanation of at least the basics is flawed. So they're saying there can't be a single book out there that like what if it's flawed because they just misspelled the author's name?
Okay.
Does that do anything to is that necessary in order for some books published by the Garden Paths to be flawed? No.
No.
Where C is saying an explanation of the basics must include an explanation of the difference between hot and cold. This needs to be true because what we're saying is they don't explain the difference between the two. In a gardening book that recommends adding compost, if it doesn't at least explain the basics, is flawed. So why else would the Garden Path book be flawed?
They didn't include the hot and cold compost, because they didn't include the hot and cold composting.
Right, and this is telling us why the hot and cold compost matters, because this is an explanation must include these things.
Okay. Okay. So I just picked one that was too strong. So when I'm looking for necessary, I'm looking for mild answers.
Yeah, you can. It can be as strong as the stimulus.
Right.
Okay. But it tends to be mild. If I'm debating between two, I go with the more mild answer. But logic comes first and then word strength.
Right. So when I had it down though, because I had it down to C and D, or C and E, sorry. I had it down to C and E, and C is the more mild answer.
I mean, it does say must
include.
Just kind of strong. But when I go back up to the stimulus and I'm saying, well, this is all we know that these things are not doing.
Yeah. Okay. I'm there.
Yay. Okay, good.
All right.